Welcome to Day-to-Day Health, a podcast all about machine learning in medicine, brought to you by two University College London PhD students. Me, Florence.
And me, Davy.
And made possible by the Turing-Roche partnership.
Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Day-to-Day Health. Sorry to put you on the spot. Who are you?
My name is Florence. I'm a PhD student here at UCL, and I am studying AI for medical imaging with relation to motor neuron disease.
And I'm Davy. I'm also at UCL, and I study contested illnesses and epistemic injustice. And today we're actually going to get into what exactly that means.
I can't wait to find out. I've been pretending like I've known for the last, 7 episodes? Yeah.
Incredible work. I wouldn't have known. So this is going to be a sort of special episode where I'm going to shine a spotlight on my research and my PhD project and talk about it in relation to both our overarching theme of multimodal health data and in relation to the North Star or key aims of the Turing-Roche Strategic Health Partnership, which probably bears some explaining too. So the Turing Institute and Roche Pharmaceuticals have teamed up for a 5-year partnership in which they're using advanced data science methods, including AI, to investigate large, complex clinical healthcare datasets to better understand how and why patients respond differently to treatment and how treatment can be improved. So Florence and I are creating this podcast in our role this year as community scholars, and we are aiming to bring awareness to the use of multimodal health data and AI in healthcare. However, of course, we're also PhD students, and we're grateful to be able to talk a bit about our own projects here too. So this episode will be about my work, and then next time we get to hear all about Florence's. Side note, a warning for this episode, well, time permitting, we will be getting a teensy bit philosophical, as I am in fact a philosopher of science and not a hard scientist like the wonderful Florence.
Yeah, I think some people might disagree with you on that one. I don't consider myself a hard scientist, but I thank you for the praise. And, because I'm not a philosopher of science, as Davy said, I'll be asking questions along the way. And, as PhD students, we study the same topic for over 3 years, just kind of by ourselves. So it's super, super, super easy to get bogged down in all the details when we're explaining our work without realising that we need to explain the most simple concepts first. So I'm sure Dave will do an excellent job, but I'm definitely going to get stuck with that in the next episode. So I'm going to try and stop that from happening here. And Dave will do the same favour for me in the next one.
Yeah, we're going to be each other's audiences. So first of all, I thought I would start off with some definitions. So what is a contested illness? A contested illness is one for which there is no consensus from science and medicine as to what the illness is, how best to classify it, how to treat it, and as to what causes it, among other things. So some examples you might have heard of are things like fibromyalgia and myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. Although there are some more obscure ones like multiple chemical sensitivity, where people seem to be allergic to pretty much everything in their environment. Yeah.
Oh God, that sounds awful.
There's a whole world of poorly understood illnesses out there, but I hone in on fibromyalgia for the most part.
Yeah, I've got a quick question already, actually. So they're called contested illnesses. Mm-hmm. Who are contesting the illnesses? Are contesting the existence of them, or is it doctors who are contesting them? Do we not know what they are exactly, or maybe there's something else entirely?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So in some cases it's medical professionals. So people saying I've seen this type of patient before, I think they're just a bit depressed, I think, maybe they're a bit lazy and they don't want to go to work. I don't think this is an actual illness. This is maybe a collection of symptoms. Mm-hmm. But then also you get more academic discussions as to the nature of, is this a discrete illness itself? Is it on a spectrum of distress reactions where a more overt one might be a big sort of mental breakdown. On the other end, you've got this sort of turning in, so it becomes pain, fatigue. And there's loads and loads of arguments like that. What is it exactly? There's also what causes it? And it's strange with a lot of these, it would be if we knew an exact causative agent, then we would go oh yeah, it's this thing caused by this infection, and that feels like it would wrap it up neatly with a bow. But that's not something we get here. It's all sort of vague and misunderstood. And this is a huge theme that I will keep coming back to in this, which is that where science and medicine can't come to a consensus, can't agree, like some people think, oh, it comes from childhood trauma, oh, it comes from stress reaction, oh, it comes from, X, Y, Z, or like it comes from an acute injury that never heals properly, whatever. This failure to be able to identify a causative agent, which not everything has not everything is like a bacterial infection, or is it an exact, we know exactly this causes this. And there's so much more misunderstood and not understood illnesses out there that we sort of accept.
Yeah, I mean, cancer, for example. I mean, everyone says everything's carcinogenic, but there's no,
direct
I don't
line.
know, there's no exact, well, because you did this thing in 2006, this is why you have a cancer diagnosis in 2024. So maybe, that's like a very small version. I don't think cancer is a contested illness, but,
Yeah. And the thing that I'll keep coming back to is that often translates to a sort of suspicion on the patient, like, oh, we don't know where this has come from. Are you sure you're sick, sort of thing?
Yeah.
So another sort of hallmark of contested illnesses, so very much unlike cancer in this regard, is that they tend to involve symptoms that are very vague and subjective and can't be reliably measured if they can be measured at all. So things like chronic pain, chronic fatigue, cognitive disturbances, often referred to as brain fog, so not being able to concentrate or remember things very well, or tripping over or slurring words, foggy brain, basically.
Like if you've got a really bad flu, maybe, and you feel like you've got a foggy brain, is that kind of what it's
Yeah,
like?
trying to think through cotton wool sort of thing.
Yeah.
And these symptoms are sometimes labelled MUS, or medically unexplained symptoms. And again, you'll notice there, it's saying that medicine doesn't know what causes them, but unfortunately, this often, it doesn't understand what causes the symptoms, like their mechanisms, what have you, but this often translates to suspicion of the patient. And a quick sidebar here, when I say these symptoms are vague and subjective, I'm not dismissing them. I'm not saying they are minor. In fact, they're often severely debilitating or disabling to experience, but they are vague in the eyes of our scientised medical system. So all over pain without an acute cause sounds vague. And it is subjective in that no one can really understand the level of pain you are in by objective means. We can't do a blood test or an X-ray for pain or brain fog. Someone needs to have experienced a similar symptom to somewhat understand you. And there are limits to our language and communication around these symptoms too, which I might get into if we've got time later in terms of hermeneutic resources.
Hermeneutic resources?
Yes.
Wow.
It's just to do with the language that we have and the ability we have using that language to express ourselves accurately. But
Interesting. Is Herman a person?
No.
I'm asking what the people want here.
Hermeneutic as referring to a language and expression, as opposed to a Dr. Herman.
I was
and
thinking
and all his resources. So if you think about the limits of language here, how much does it hurt? Lots. How bad is it? It's the worst pain I've ever felt. How bad is the fatigue? Terrible. It doesn't really paint a very clinical picture. And the doctor, for a multitude of reasons, may think that the patient is exaggerating or being insincere. And we'll circle back to this.
I think about this all the time, the idea of trying to explain pain. Because, and even I don't have chronic pain. And even me trying to explain pain when I do feel it to a doctor is so confusing. It's rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. Is this a linear scale? What is 10? Is 10
right.
death? I've never been stabbed. So, is stab number 10? I don't want to say it's number 10. I've not experienced all the scale of pain. And, I think that might be a me problem getting into my head a lot with that, wanting to be completely, accurate.
No, but that's a huge thing.
Yeah.
And also, what if I say 8, but my 8 is different to the doctor's 8. So the doctor's like, an 8's probably fine. And you're like, I'm writhing in agony, but I didn't want to say 10 because that would be going too far.
And that's why they have those smiley faces now as well, isn't it? So you can be like, I am sad.
Yeah.
I guess that makes more sense. It's more of a human thing than just a number. But
even that is wildly subjective.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
How bad am I? A big frowny face.
That's how I describe my feelings. But even going beyond just rating pain is so subjective. And also pain changes with memory. So I don't know, if you're in pain at the moment and you are with a doctor and you're like, oh, this is bad. But then maybe 2 weeks later you're like, well, it was bad. But, and even people giving birth, they forget the pain. They biologically can forget the pain so that they can keep having children. That's an edge case. But,
I mean, it affects around half the population.
Well, an edge case. It's not
in the annals of pain
kids
experience, I suppose.
It's not a contested illness case.
Quite. And pain scales and the inadequacy of our expression is a whole minefield. And another quick sidebar. I don't mean to suggest that for a symptom to be real, that it has to be measurable by today's medical imaging or testing of symptoms. So we don't, for example, do MRIs or biopsies to check that you are indeed feeling dizzy, weak or nauseous, for example. Normally, you self-report such symptoms and the doctor just takes you at your word. Unfortunately, for medically unexplained symptoms, patients often report that doctors believe them until a blood test comes back fine and then the doctor suddenly treats them with suspicion. And this is a byproduct of this scientised medical system where it's quicker and cheaper to run a blood test than spend a long time in consultation with a patient. And I could go on a rant here about why we need to bring back a focus on the art of medicine and the genuine positive properties of the placebo response provoked by a good doctor-patient relationship, but I might just end up editing it all back out due to time constraints. So
I love all these sidebars that you have of and I could go on for this for approximately 4 hours, but maybe we'll have time, maybe we won't.
You don't understand the terrible, terrible power of giving me an episode to talk about my research. I'm like, there's so much.
What have I done?
I know. And also, technically, a lot of illnesses are contested, so we don't actually know a whole lot about the causes or intricacies of things like irritable bowel syndrome and gout. And yet these sort of have a social acceptance behind them. And potentially that's due to the type of person who gets them. So if we look at gout, it's a lot of elder wealthy men. We could discuss about that compared to fibromyalgia and ME.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned causes of disease, because this made me think of motor neuron disease, which I work on, or Lou Gehrig's disease, if you are American, because there are some theories as to what causes it, but there is no real consensus. And I was thinking that kind of reminded me of what you were talking about, even though, again, I don't think motor neuron disease is a contested disease, it's just a rare disease. But it's also under debate whether some things that look like motor neuron disease are a motor neuron disease, which again made me think, I was reading what you had written down. I was like, oh yeah, that is similar.
These issues around classification, I always think it's interesting where we're going, where are we drawing the exact boundary around this disease entity? But at the same time, it's how useful is that? Yeah. Particularly on the ground for patients. Even if it doesn't present quite exactly as a classic motor neuron disease, sorry, I'm talking out of my behind for this because I don't know much about MND, if it can still be treated with the sort of drugs or treatments available, then does it matter where the classificatory boundary is? Arguably no. But then on a philosophical lens, you might be more interested in going out, but where is the boundary? Where does it become this? Is it a spectrum rather than a discrete entity? Anyway.
Yeah, I know. And it's also, MND is also interesting because there is no definitive test for it either. It's a ruling out of other things, and then finally, if nothing comes back positive, you're like, well, I think it might be motor neuron disease. Which again, I was reading what you'd written, I was like, yeah,
that's so interesting.
It's weirdly, it's not a tested illness, I'm pretty sure, but I was seeing what similarities, and I think this also gets back to when I started working in kind of healthcare medical stuff. I was so shocked from being a civilian and coming into this world how kind of little is known about a lot of diseases in general. Being I thought we would have known that already, but still, it's active research. People always change. Illness is changing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we tend to have this view of the epistemic institutions, the knowledge-making institutions of science and medicine. Not that they are these actual defined entities, but we tend to go it's scientific, so it's objective, so we know everything, and it's it's an iterative process, and we might go back on things and change things. Yeah, it's funny to be able to go well, that's contested, but that is solid fact, sort of thing. It's how useful are these definitions anyway?
100%.
So this thing I've mentioned already that I'll come back to, but this is particular to contested illnesses. There is a notion that they're somehow illegitimate or psychosomatic or some other level of imaginary or spuriously real. I mean, even if something was psychosomatic, so mental illness producing physical symptoms, that's still an illness.
I mean, there's a whole field of functional neurology, right? Is that what it is? Functional neurological diseases, which like have no cause. They're not technically, real, but they cause real symptoms. They cause real issues for people.
And I think it's like it's a cultural thing, and I'm particularly looking to like Western medicine here when I say we tend to rank physical and mental illness in that order. So it's physical illness is sort of more real than mental illness, and that's very much still tied to like mental health stigma. And then you get these things that are sort of like, well, are they physical or are they mental?
Yeah.
And they've just become classed as like less quote unquote real than either of those. I was going to bring this up later, but there's someone who describes fibromyalgia as a classificatory monstrosity, in that you can't say, yeah, that was a mouthful.
Yeah, wow. Oh
yeah, say that 10 times fast.
Oh my God, never mind, I won't try.
But yeah, where they don't fit neatly into any box, people just tend to go like, you made it up, which is a wild conclusion to jump to, but in the sort of popular imagination, that's often where it goes. So we could talk about, in relation to this, the feminisation of these illnesses. They're often seen as women's illnesses, unfairly, as I'll get to. Medical misogyny and the complex web of societal stigmas around illnesses deemed to be mental in origin, and stigma around chronic contested illnesses more generally. But we'll get to that if we can.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you say that, about the concept of hysteria in women historically. That's stupid. Concept of hysteria in women historically is, she's hysterical, but she was like deeply depressed or, having actual illness.
Yeah, I mean, so I've done a bit of research on this for some previous work looking at ME. And what's fascinating is that, so hysteria represents a particular image of an ill woman, in that it's a portrayal of irrationality in illness, but also an illness that is done for a reason or for secondary benefit. For, like, the idea is, oh, well, she's acting out because she wants attention or she wants to get her way, and it actually, the notion of itself, obviously, like, you go far back enough, it's the wandering womb and it's the woman's anatomy that means her brain doesn't, but that was like specifically leveraged during the French Revolution to deny equal rights to women, to say that, this is our declaration on the rights of men, and people who, there were women at the time who were like, what about us? And that diagnosis was leveraged to be like, you're not cognitively capable, I'm afraid, to actually... Isn't that wild? It was like a tool of oppression.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you trace the history of like hysteria, you tend to come into... It ends up tying to the beginnings of our understanding of fibromyalgia and ME. So contested illnesses, not seen as objectively quote-unquote real, and rather than this highlighting the paucity of scientific understanding in these areas or indicating a need for further research, instead the contested label tends to translate to suspicion of the patient.
Maybe because of what I said earlier about people thinking that medical knowledge is infallible sometimes. And so, the doctor's not wrong, must be the patient. They're not medically trained.
Massively, and that notion will come up in the epistemic and justice stuff. So these illnesses are sometimes called emergent illnesses, as they're sort of seen as like new or as a product of the modern age. There was an idea for a while that ME was like a 20th century illness caused by the ills of modern society. Obviously, that's kind of rubbish. And I would avoid that descriptor in particular because it, again, impinges on like how real the illness is seen to be. But for something like long COVID, which falls into the contested category because we don't know much about it yet, and it has medically unexplained symptoms which overlap with symptoms of ME and fibro. So fatigue, muscle aches, cognitive disruption, depression and anxiety. It is new. Yeah. It is emergent.
I mean, it's in the name.
Exactly. So my research focuses particularly on fibromyalgia, so that's going to be our case study for today. And why fibromyalgia, for both my research and for this podcast? So a few reasons. Fibromyalgia affects a lot of people, roughly between 1.8 and 2.9 million people in the UK and around 2% of the global population.
That's way more than I thought it was. Reading those figures, that is incredibly surprising to me.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, especially if you look at like how many people suffer with any form of chronic pain. Like there's people with like chronic back pain and what have you that doesn't get classed as fibromyalgia because it has to be widespread across multiple body sites to be fibromyalgia. But there's like 32 million people in the UK with a form of chronic pain, and it's like that could then become fibromyalgia. Yeah, I think it's like a lot of people don't realise how wide a problem this is. It can have a devastating impact on people's lives, and I think that's important to highlight. And there are really poor treatment pathways, especially as I look at the UK NHS specific context. And we're really low on available effective treatments and just research generally into it. Chronic contested illnesses are also on the rise generally. And so the things I say today in relation to fibromyalgia will be applicable across different illnesses, including ME and long COVID, given their symptom clusters and similarities in presentations. And for long COVID, a rough estimate of how many people in the UK are suffering from it is 1.1 million people over the age of 3, or again, just under 2% of the population. But the report I got that figure from says the actual rate could be considerably higher. I just feel like we're heading towards some sort of healthcare emergency around chronic illnesses.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
So I've been banging on about it. So what is fibromyalgia? It's a chronic contested illness. It's characterised by widespread chronic pain, fatigue and cognitive disturbances. There is also a huge mental symptom comorbidity rate, including experiences of anxiety and depression, and a large number of patients meeting the criteria for PTSD. And there's also a huge number of secondary symptoms that present heterogeneously in the patient population. So some examples include some people have trouble regulating their temperature, some people have IBS, some people have sleeping difficulties, including insomnia and waking unrefreshed.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll get into this later, but do you think these comorbidities are part of the disease or caused by living with the symptoms of the disease? Because this happens, again, bring it back to motor neuron disease, the only disease I know anything about. A common behavioural symptom is apathy, so not caring about things, to put it simply. But there's a bit of discussion of, well, if you got diagnosed with a terminal disease, would you also be a bit apathetic to some things? Or is that, because it changes the brain, is that part of the behavioural changes because of brain atrophy?
Yeah, no, this is actually like a huge point of contention in the literature. So is it that fibromyalgia develops as part of being like a symptom of depression? Like that's something we know a bit more of nowadays, that mental illnesses can have physical symptoms. So one of the things is if you're depressed, you can feel like pain. So is it that fibromyalgia is therefore a sort of continuation or a form of depression? Or is it you're in constant pain every day?
Yeah.
And so you end up depressed or a bit anxious, What we've sort of... I say as if I do the front line.
You can say we, it's fine.
What we've sort of concluded, the general sort of consensus nowadays is that fibromyalgia presents with physical and mental symptoms, and the depression and the anxiety and that sort of thing is a part of the fibromyalgia experience. However, I mentioned PTSD. The percentages, which I didn't put in my document here, but I can put in the show notes later if anyone really wants the number. There's like a huge percentage of people with fibromyalgia who meet the criteria for PTSD, and it's something crazy. It's like 70%. Yeah. Whereas like the UK-wide number of people who have PTSD is like 3% of the population. And I don't know, I might get into it more later, but like one of the things we think causes fibromyalgia, or certainly contributes to it, is experiences of prolonged stress, which cause an overproduction of the hormone cortisol, which causes a denaturing or functional changes in your HPA axis, which is the one that regulates a lot of like your body's reactions to stress and things like that. And it actually causes functional changes in like your nervous system and in your brain. And that's sort of like a thing that ticks over into experiencing fibromyalgia. So, it's people having experienced like either chronic stress caused by like repeated incidents, or one big traumatic thing that you then are sort of like living with can cause this. I've kind of gone off on a tear there, but I just think it's really interesting that it's like it's a mental symptom, but it's also sort of like the causative.
Part of the cause, yeah, that's really interesting.
Okay, so moving on, let's talk about fibromyalgia in terms of the Turing-Roche Health Partnership goals.
Yeah, so I'll just jump in and talk about the research aims of the Turing-Roche Health Partnership. So this partnership is concerned with 3 main themes. Structured missingness, so this is about who is left out of available data. And missingness is kind of when, for example, if you go to the doctors and they give you a blood test but they don't test for certain things, that those test results would be considered missing if someone's looking at your data later. And sometimes this is random, like maybe just it didn't happen that day. And sometimes it can be because, you don't need that test, or you're not well enough to have a certain test, and that would be non-random missingness. And this is also very important when training AI models using missing data. The second theme is predictive modelling generally, so this is using advanced analytics and large data sets to, quotation, potentially predict and improve patient outcomes and beyond. And then the final thread is multimodal analysis, so this is how best to combine different types of health data to improve clinical care. And I think we'll get onto that more in the next episode, talk about my work. But for this work, is it more about structured missingness?
I think I've got more to say on structured missingness.
Lovely.
Yeah. So yeah, who is left out of, well, who and what is left out of the fibromyalgia data? There's a lot of people whose experiences are not recorded in the literature. So who's left out of the fibromyalgia data? As it turns out, a lot of people. That because there is this like common misconception or stereotype of fibromyalgia being a woman's illness, and that has led into sort of a very unrepresentative literature where a lot of the studies and things are mostly using white women, and there's also an issue of underdiagnosis to talk about. So this common stereotype of fibromyalgia being a woman's illness, until recently, official sources, including the NHS website, who only changed it like last year, have suggested that fibromyalgia affects women at a 7-to-1, even a 9-to-1 ratio to men.
Wow.
I know. More recent prevalence estimates using the most recent diagnostic guidelines and global data suggest a gender disparity as low as 2-to-1, even like 1-to-1.
It doesn't sound like a women's disease anymore.
It doesn't, does it? And like other studies have like noticed a change in gender prevalence over time, or like a levelling out of people who have fibromyalgia from like 82.7% female to, oh, this is levelled out to now we're getting like 60.5% female. Basically, we've seen a trend of people reassessing these things and going, oh, it's way closer than we thought it was. So Wolf et al. In 2018 write, the relation between fibromyalgia and gender is controversial and confusing, but that the perception of fibromyalgia as almost exclusively, greater or equal to 90%, a woman's disorder is not supported by data in unbiased studies. Nevertheless, women tend to make up the majority of clinical populations. And if we look into why that is, to a certain percent, it's provider bias. So very quickly, I said clinical populations. There is a difference between CRIT FM, patients who meet the criteria in like epidemiological surveys, and CLIN FM, so the people who actually have a clinical diagnosis from a physician. So women tend to make up the majority of people with a clinical diagnosis. And yes, this can be down to provider bias. So healthcare practitioners will say, oh, well, I try to avoid giving a fibromyalgia diagnosis to men because I don't want to stigmatise them with a women's illness, which is wild because it's like you've just denied them a diagnosis, which means they're not going to be able to access like treatment or care.
Oh my gosh.
And also they'll say things like, well, because it's a women's thing, I diagnose it like far more readily in women. I also think that there's also a thing to do with like gendered healthcare seeking behaviours.
Yeah.
Where, women will far more readily go to the doctor and men will just like wait until it's the worst possible it can be.
That's so irritating to me. It's like one of my main gripes from people. Just like, just anecdotally, so my female friends are so much more likely to go to the doctor. And this is not even for chronic stuff. This is just, like, you should just go to a doctor. And then my male friends are like, oh, I'll just leave it for ages. And it's like, so I was wondering if that played a slight part in women getting diagnosed more.
Yeah, no, good thinking. Absolutely.
Yeah, God, it's so
but it's so well, because this is like the whole discussion of like patriarchy hurts everyone, because it's like you tell men to suck it up enough and they'll be like, oh, okay, I shouldn't seek healthcare for this debilitating illness I'm experiencing.
Exactly.
And also that's another thing that men, we're going to talk about how people with fibromyalgia are treated in healthcare, but like unfortunately one of the responses men get is sort of like, well, it's a bit of pain, like man up kind of thing.
Yeah, deal with it.
Which is just bad. But then, so the flip side of that healthcare seeking behaviour is that women more often just go to the doctor, and then you get doctors in these like studies making really derisive comments about like, oh, they're always hanging around the GP's office like flies.
I mean, to be fair, I do go to the doctor a lot for like random stuff, and they're like, why are you here? Like, I just was worried. Just in case, I don't know.
I mean, I feel like we should make use of the NHS as much as we can.
Exactly. That's exactly my philosophy. Please don't cancel me for going to the doctor too much.
But yeah, so I mean, I'm not saying it is completely just that every doctor goes like, I'll only give this to a woman. Like that is massively reduction.
Yeah,
yeah, so there's also like varying diagnostic methods. Like for a while, the diagnostic criteria involved tender points. So like points that you would touch on someone's body and they would go, ow, that really hurts.
Oh.
Turns out tender points, they don't properly exist. And also women were more likely to have that sort of like, it's not even a symptom, but like women were more likely to go like, yeah, it hurts in the places where you poked me sort of thing. So I can see your little question there in the script. So I would say that, yeah, more women get diagnosed with fibromyalgia, but when you look at data like, medical records without diagnosis, it's basically a balanced gender split. Yeah. And that also is changing. Like people who are not women are now more readily getting diagnoses. Like I don't want to paint like a really black and white picture here when it's a lot more nuanced, but yeah. And for a long time, it was seen as a women's illness, and that tended to influence people's like decisions when giving diagnoses and things like that. And unfortunately, that is still in like the popular imagination as like, oh, it's a thing women get. Yeah. Which unfortunately undermines the legitimacy of it because misogyny. So Wolf et al. Say the central biasing factor is the societal belief that FM is predominantly a women's disorder, as seen in the statements of authoritative sources such as experts, respected governmental and non-governmental organisations and textbooks. And this is made worse by advertising from pharmaceutical companies that only show women and support groups that are almost completely made up of women. And such beliefs basically influence doctors such that they may, and I'm quoting, anticipate, examine and diagnose fibromyalgia more in women than men. And women are also referred to be evaluated for fibromyalgia more often, and women may be more likely to accept the diagnosis than men. So another really important point to make is that the available literature, aside from skewing female, also massively skews white. So you'll find like the populations used in like various studies, it's like 90% female, 93% white, and that is sort of like across the board. And I've seen like more recent studies going, the authors acknowledge the need for participants from different ethnic backgrounds. We need to be studying like more men. I found exactly one paper on the experiences of trans people with fibromyalgia. But as sort of a monolith, the literature focuses on white, middle-aged Western women, basically.
Yeah, where are most of these cohorts from then? Are they from the US and Europe, basically?
Okay, so I'm obviously limited by the languages I can read.
Yes, of course.
But,
how dare
you? All the literature I'm looking at comes from the UK, the US, Scandinavia a lot, actually. Yeah. And then there have been some other ones I've looked into, like experiences of patients in like Mexico, in Japan, but I'm mostly looking in a Western context. But it is strange how many things agree like across the board. So there are studies in like, you don't get a lot of white women in Japanese paper cohorts.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah.
But this matters because it has practical ramifications for patients. So people are not given the diagnosis they need in order to access care and treatment due to not fitting the stereotype of being a person with fibromyalgia, which is seen as a white middle-aged woman. And it also means that people who aren't this might feel unwelcome in fibromyalgia support spaces, which is important to their general well-being. And it also means their experiences are potentially not represented by the literature. And research into structural health stigma suggests people who are multiply marginalised and are going to have a harder time accessing and navigating the healthcare system as it is.
So multiply marginalised, just to clarify that, because I actually have not heard that phrase before. Is that
sure. So a person who has multiple societal marginalisations.
So potentially like a black woman they also experience racism and sexism.
Yeah,
is that kind of what it is?
That's exactly what we're talking about. And I would say that it's not even particularly easier as a white cis woman to navigate the healthcare system.
Well, no, of course not.
But they are the most represented in the literature, so we know the most about what their experiences and struggles are. And so efforts to improve experiences are currently based on a white woman's journey, as it were, which leaves out a lot of people. Also, so people with fibromyalgia face a lot of like disbelief, unfortunately, and sort of negative reactions. And the worse someone is treated or feels treated in a healthcare space, the more likely they are to measurably get worse. and start avoiding healthcare and maybe even become disenfranchised altogether from the medical system, which is sort of how structural stigmas have such a huge impact on community health from people in marginalised communities. So people from communities who've been historically poorly treated by the healthcare establishment already come in with a sort of warranted distrust of the system.
I feel like that came up quite a lot with the COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
There was a lot of information about how more marginalised communities were less keen to take the COVID vaccine because of, as you said, warranted distrust of the healthcare system.
So my project basically aims to address the representativeness, again, what a mouthful, of the literature somewhat. I mean, I'm one person, I can only do so much with my study, but I'm recruiting people who are not white cis women. So that could be people who are not white and or not cis and or not women, to talk about their experiences both in terms of living with fibro and navigating the healthcare system with fibro. So I'm going to do a web survey asking to what extent people's experiences align with those reported in the literature by white women, and then a series of in-depth interviews with a smaller number of responders to tease out exactly how their experiences differ or agree with the literature and what the key challenges are that they face in living with and seeking healthcare with fibromyalgia.
How do you go about finding these people?
So I'm literally about to start the recruitment process.
Exciting.
I say literally in a month.
That's pretty literally for a PhD project. I don't know, I think a month is like basically tomorrow in industry.
So my aim is I'm going through a number of charities, support groups, associations, basically, and I'll be contacting them and saying, would you mind sharing this out to your network and support groups and things like that? And I don't want to offend anyone, but I am literally saying, like, I want to talk to you, but if you are a white cis woman, I don't want to talk to you, which I hope that doesn't upset anyone, but it's like, no, I specifically need these experiences.
It's for research, so I think it makes a bit more sense. But that's tricky because also you spoke earlier saying people who are not white cis women find it less appealing to go into these support spaces. So if you're going to support spaces to find non-white, non-cis, non-women,
it might be tricky.
It's tricky.
So I originally intended to also go through pain clinics, NHS pain clinics, because I was like, that means I'll have a much wider, much more diverse population of people. And the ethics committee said, did you know that to do anything with the NHS, you have to go through their ethics board as well? And that process was going to take maybe a year or more and would involve. And I just ended up going for the purposes of finishing my PhD, I'm just going to say I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to have to address that in my methods section because it's I wanted to do that to improve my sample and it ended up being not possible, basically.
Yeah, that's a very common story.
So very, very quickly, in our section of who is missing and in the data, also fibromyalgia might just be massively underdiagnosed. It's a theme in the literature. A lot of studies suggest that far more people fit the diagnostic criteria than have a diagnosis. I've put some things here, so in Wallet from 2015, 73% who fit the criteria didn't have a diagnosis. Nakamura, 2014, 94.5% meeting the criteria sought healthcare for their symptoms, but only 2.5% received a diagnosis.
Yikes. So, do you think, we spoke about this before, do doctors just not want to commit to a diagnosis that is contested? Does it look bad on them?
Genuinely, this is reported by healthcare professionals interviewed in the literature, a lot of them don't want to give a contested diagnosis. And some of it is I don't really believe that it exists, so why would I give that label? I don't think it's a thing. And some of them are I don't want to do that to the patient. I don't want to give them this thing. And it's so weird because diagnosis is this weird experience for patients where it's brilliant and terrible at the same time. Because it might be look, I've been seeking care for this weird thing that's happening to me for 5 years and I finally know I have a name for it. And it's and it's chronic and we can't cure it and we can barely treat it and there's not a lot to, this is from a Mexican, a study of people with fibromyalgia in the Mexican healthcare system. Some people were relieved. This is Colmenares Roa et al. 2016, I believe.
Nice memory, oh my gosh.
I've cited the paper a lot. It's a freaking great paper. But someone was I just wanted to go throw myself under a train. How do you respond to that? Especially as the doctor is there you go, we did it. Yeah. Diagnosis. And the person is oh my God.
Yeah.
So and some people are I don't want to stigmatise the patient. And it's people would generally speaking rather know and rather than be able to access fibromyalgia-specific care. But at the same time, yeah, you get healthcare professionals who look down on it. People are like, I don't want to give you this label because it means every time you come for healthcare, people are going to be like, you're one of those.
Yeah. Well, it's complex. There's very complex reasons all around it. Gosh.
Very much so. And also, so under this theme, Turing-Roche are looking at structured messiness in heterogeneous data.
So heterogeneous or heterogeneous means lots of different people mixed up, not all just one sample.
Yeah. And I thought I would very briefly sort of bring this up in terms of fibromyalgia because it presents wildly heterogeneously.
I say heterogeneous, but I also say homogeneous. So I'm not consistent.
I'm going to say different. I'm going to say differently. So in fibromyalgia, who the patient is can vary wildly. It's not just white women, as we've discussed. How the disease presents in them can vary wildly. So I mentioned these like minor symptoms that crop up in different people. So some people experience the temperature thing where they're like always too cold or too hot. Some people have really trouble with like insomnia and waking up feeling unrefreshed. And there's like a huge constellation of these secondary symptoms that, are experienced completely differently. And I found a thing the other day where it was like, well, it involves changes to like your hypothalamus, and that is to do with maintaining homeostasis in your body. So actually that kind of makes sense.
That does make sense.
But people tend to be like, well, this isn't a real thing because we've got a person over here who has chronic pain but they're cold all the time, and a person over here who has like nausea, and that's not the same thing. Yeah. So I think it's really interesting that aside from like the three key symptoms of pain, fatigue and cognitive disturbances, that we've got a disease that presents so wildly differently, which seems to like gel with what the partnership are doing. And also there's like massive differences in treatments, as in like things that are suggested, but also the way people respond to the treatments, even like responding to the actual pharmaceutical drugs that we have. And so the Turing-Roche partnership they say that they recognise the need for individualised treatment as a one-size-fits-all treatment doesn't actually fit all. And I think that's hugely applicable in the case of fibromyalgia. So aside from these core symptoms, we've got all these secondary symptoms, but also the severity can fluctuate from person to person. Some people might have like really, really terrible, I can't get out of bed fatigue, whereas someone might be like, I was very tired, but I managed to push through it, what have you. Same with pain. And it can also fluctuate within a person. That is to say, like you might have like a good day or a good week and then a very, very bad week. Yeah. So it's fluctuating. You get things like flare-ups, where it's like, okay, and then it gets really bad for a bit. And again, this can impinge on the legitimacy of the illness. Like people go like, well, you were fine yesterday. And it's like, well, I still had the illness. It's just it's bad today. I
find it really tricky. I find it must be very tricky for people with flare-up kind of diseases. And even like I myself have had eczema. I know I'm a real trooper. And that is very much a flare-up kind of thing. Like it gets triggered. And it's so irritating to have like really bad eczema and then it closes up in 2 weeks and I finally get my doctor's appointment. Yeah. And they're like, but it's fine. I'm like, no, but it did happen. I have pictures. And like I can take pictures because it's eczema, it's on my skin. But you can't take pictures of chronic pain. I guess it's like a selfie in bed, like, hey,
no, indeed, yeah.
This
is me suffering.
Yeah, like, doctor be like, okay, thanks for the selfie, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, do you know if people with fibromyalgia try and go to the doctor, if they do go to the doctor on a bad day to try and up their credibility to the doctor, or like is that kind of a thing that people do? Is it a strategy?
So this is something that has been, again, sort of like studied and looked at in terms of how patient, like, not necessarily support groups, but even like things in forums and things, patients discuss strategies when it comes going to the doctor. Because there's the idea of, well, you don't want to look too sick, like you're really hamming it up, but then you don't want to look too put together because they won't. And it's this weird thing of like performing illness. And these are people who are legitimately ill, but because their symptoms are invisible, they have to, and because they are often judged simply on appearance. Yeah. Like that's sort of like a common thing they face is like, well, you don't look sick.
So you don't want to put makeup on because then you'll look too good.
There's literally, I remember in one study, this is one of the Scandinavian studies, there was this woman talking about like she was so upset because she'd gone to the doctor and been told like you're fine, and she was like, I knew I shouldn't have done it, but I was wearing like quite nice clothes and I'd been to like a tanning bed like the day before and all of this and it's wild, that's
mad.
Being judged on like just sort of how you look. And there was another one which I think was Aspring and Navanen, are they Norwegian? I don't want to get it wrong, but okay, I think it was another Scandinavian study again. But like a doctor being like, well, I don't really believe the levels of pain that they're reporting because, like, look, they're sitting on a chair in the waiting room and they seem fine, and they walk into me and they seem fine. And it's like, well, that's because it's something that they live with every single day.
Yeah, it's such a good point, actually.
There's this sort of like weird resilience of being in a certain level of pain for so long. Like you learn to deal with it. You can't go through life. You can't be sat on that chair in the waiting room flailing and screaming about, even if you wanted to. You know, there's...
Yeah. You get used to dealing with it and dealing with trying to keep it under wraps, I would assume.
Yeah. It's this tightrope line, basically, of like, how put together should I look and how a complete mess should I look? And the consensus is sort of like, find a balance.
In an incredibly trivial sense. It's like calling up sick for work.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound too not sick, but I don't want to really ham it up because then they'll think I'm lying, but I'm not lying. So I guess I'll just cough once on the phone. like imagine I have to do that, you know, just to go to the doctor. I can't even imagine that. That sounds like mental gymnastics.
Yeah, it's a struggle for credibility. And then, so there's wildly different treatments and things. First of all, there's a different whether you go through like the NHS or a private pathway. So obviously private doctors have more time to listen to you, more resources. They're not trying to kick you out 10 minutes after into your appointment.
Yeah.
But if we look at the options through the NHS, there are some medications. There is referral to CAM or complementary and alternative medicine. So things like acupuncture. There's also pain clinics where you go and, okay, you only get like whatever it is, like 6 weeks there or something. But then you get to see someone who deals with your medication, someone who gives you some physio, and someone who gives you some psychological treatment. There's also, I will say, there are high levels of self-medication in these populations, which I think is regrettable but understandable. And also some like complementary and alternative medicine, I'm like, yeah, there's evidence for that and that seems okay. And if it's on the NHS, fine. And then there's some stuff that I feel is really exploitative of patients where people are like, buy my £120 mushroom tea and it will fix your ME.
Honestly, tell me about it.
I think that's all very sort of scummy and I hate that.
I think it's that really reminds me of the whole mindfulness market, I guess is the word. Like there are lots of products of like, buy this headband and it will slightly vibrate on your head and this will it's proven to work to decrease, I don't know, symptoms of ADHD or something, and it's £600 and you have to subscribe to it for £60 a month, but don't worry, it's for you, we're doing it for you. And it boggles my mind that companies can do that because I don't think it works. But
no, and it's predatory.
It's completely predatory.
I hate it. Yeah. So we do have some pharmaceutical options for fibromyalgia. A lot of them are things like antidepressants like amitriptyline, anticonvulsants like gabapentin, anti-anxiety medications, pain medications to an extent. And there are some FDA-approved fibromyalgia-specific drugs. And there are things like cognitive behavioural therapy, although, so like Hauser and Fitzcharles, 2018, they did a big debunking fibromyalgia myths sort of paper.
Ooh.
And they note that the available evidence doesn't actually support the efficacy of these treatments. So a lot of these treatments are basically notoriously ineffective, have really bad side effects, which make people not enjoy taking them. And also patients tend to acclimatise to doses. So they could start on a low dose of a thing and go, oh, that's helpful. Oh, it's worn off. We'll up it. Oh, that's helpful. Oh, it's worn off. And then it's like, well, you're at the top dose of the medication now, so you might as well come off it or try something else, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
I've written out a whole bunch of like statistics and things here from my research into this. I'm just going to read one for the purposes of time. So, for example, a Cochrane review of milnacipran, which is an antidepressant, found that doses of 100 milligram and 200 milligrams of milnacipran provided moderate levels of pain relief, so about a 30% reduction in pain intensity for around 40% of participants. However, 86% of participants experienced adverse effects, which were more common in the higher dose group. So 7% of participants in the 100 milligram dose group dropped out due to lack of efficacy, and 7.2% in the 200 milligram dose group.
So pretty similar between the high and low dose, then.
Yes.
That's interesting.
And for adverse effects, 19% of participants in the 100 milligram dose group dropped out, and 24%, that's 1 in 4, of the 200 milligram dose group. So the authors concluded that milnacipran may be effective in treating FM for a minority of patients. However, those who take it are likely to experience adverse effects. And that is pretty much the same for all these other ones.
Interesting that antidepressant is a pain relief. Do you think that harks back to what you were saying earlier about depression can cause pain? Maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like half of it is like, oh, we're sort of like dampening the same regions of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, like some people read that of like, oh, the doctor didn't listen to me and thinks I'm mental, and that's why they've put me on this.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
There are some other things that were made specifically for fibromyalgia, but again, it's like they tend to be either they don't really do anything or discontinuation rates are super high.
Yeah.
Like there was a 12-month study that suggested that duloxetine had a 51% discontinuation rate, milnacipran had a 62% discontinuation rate, and pregabalin had a 65% discontinuation rate.
And discontinuation means you just stop taking it.
The patient stopped taking it because it's either not helpful to them or it's causing horrible side effects.
61% discontinuation
it's pretty bad.
Pretty bad.
So the pharmaceutical interventions are not significantly successful in reducing symptom severity and they have bad side effects. And also, I just want to really quickly point out that even in these Cochrane reviews for the various drugs, the patient population, again, skews white and female. So just for example, that milnacipran review, in their 7 studies, between 92 and 97% of the participants were women and between 84 and 93% were white.
So even in that homogenous group, it still has that much variability in how the treatment works.
Yeah, no, it's so ripe for the AI and big data sets and things to get in there and find out what on earth is going on.
Yeah.
Very briefly on predictive modelling, although this is absolutely not my area, I did have a little look to see are there basically studies using sort of open data sets, that sort of thing, using AI. And I found 2 that were quite interesting. So there's Balducci et al. In 2022. They present an open data set of 33 fibromyalgia female patients and 33 paired healthy controls from a Mexican population. So they say, although fibromyalgia physiopathology is still not fully understood, neuroimaging research methods have shown brain structural and functional alterations, as well as neuroinflammation abnormalities. We believe that open access to data may help fibromyalgia research advance more. I just think that's the sort of thing that will really move this forwards. Because for the longest time, there's been a whole thing about like, well, there are no biomarkers. You can't see fibromyalgia in the body. And it's like, you actually can.
I need to look for it. You need to create data sets to look for it.
Exactly. So it's a small data set, but it's a step in the right direction. And then, this might shine a light on some more of the more elusive physiological signs and symptoms. And then we've got Zetterman et al. 2024, paper called Machine Learning Identifies Fatigue as a Key Symptom of Fibromyalgia, reflected in tyrosine, purine, pyrimidine, and glutaminergic metabolism.
Yeah, I think glutaminergic. I've heard that one from like House or something.
And this, just to my above point, machine learning employed to strengthen our understanding in fibromyalgia in physiological and biomedical terms. Not that should be the gold standard, but I think it will be helpful for legitimising fibromyalgia some more and push back at the notion of it being like all in your head and imaginary. But this is really interesting because they're looking at diagnosing. So they say algorithms trained with the Fibromyalgia Impact Questionnaire information assigned the fibromyalgia diagnosis and new data with balanced accuracy of 88%.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. And with these metabolites, fibromyalgia could be identified in new cases with 79% accuracy. I just think it's great because we've moved from the days of poking someone and going, does it hurt here?
Well, yes.
To
Look, I'm interested in the label for that. So the label is a fibromyalgia diagnosis, which we've said before is a fairly elusive diagnosis. So potentially the label fibromyalgia in these studies is quite a relatively easy label because these are the people who actually got a diagnosis. Maybe the ones that are like, doctor was like, I mean, this is more obvious. I can't really deny this now. There probably is fibromyalgia. So it's good accuracy. I've not read the paper, but it's good accuracy. But that also might be part of it.
Yeah, but this could be, revolutionary, dare I say, just because it's really hard to diagnose it with accuracy. And again, people doubt its legitimacy due to a lack of biomarkers. And here we found that machine learning led to a conclusion that there are these certain metabolic markers. But I'm not going to stay too long on that point because I believe that's going to be much more in your ballpark. And then also if we sort of briefly look at multimodal analysis, so what varying types of health data do we have on fibro itself? I've written a huge list here, and just for the benefit of everyone, I'm going to skim through and say there are observed differences in the central nervous system, brain matter, immune system responses between people with fibromyalgia and healthy controls. So again, that notion of we can't like see it in the body. I mean, we can. It's just that it doesn't come up in like normal imaging or normal sort of like I say, blood tests, biopsies, X-rays. Yeah. It's not. It doesn't show up clearly. It's things like
things that require longer tests, such as maybe functional MRI, where you need to have a sort of pain test, and also these things are very expensive to run.
Yeah.
So unless it's in a research study, I don't know the general clinical pathway for someone who presents with fibromyalgia symptoms, but I would assume they're not being like, send them for an fMRI, because it is very overbooked and very expensive to run.
Absolutely. And then if we're looking at different multimodal health data, what data can we get? And aside from like standard measures like height, weight, blood pressure, well, we can kind of measure pain. We can't really. It's a subjective symptoms.
That was a quick turnaround.
We can't. I say we technically can. There's a thing called a dolorimeter, which is supposed to measure pain levels. It's notoriously crap at doing so. We don't really use them anymore. But it's like a thing with like a pressure bit on the end, and you push it into the skin until someone says ow, and they go, oh, it's this much pain.
Oh, like a tender point thing then, what you were saying before.
Yeah.
It's quite similar to that then.
And sometimes they actually use these meters rather than like poking. That's how I found out that they existed actually. And yeah, we've spoken about the sort of
the smiley face
scale, which is all very subjective. The main type of health data, and this is like my big point for this section, is that the main health data on information of experiences of fibromyalgia come from patient self-report. Which is oddly looked down upon or not taken as quote-unquote real health data, which definitely ties back to this whole like suspicion of the patient. But my argument is that patient self-report is actually crucial health data for an illness that you can't otherwise get data on.
I'm wondering whether this distrust of self-report data also comes from non-healthcare spaces for like, a random survey. And it's like, how much money do you make? And some people always overinflate it, or like, how good of a driver do you think you are? And everyone thinks they're above average, which is literally impossible.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether it's that distrust of people generally reporting things about themselves that's bleeding into distrust of patients and self-report data.
There's also this idea of people who do it for like secondary gain, quote unquote. So it's like, oh, you're lying or exaggerating because I can tell that you just want time off work, or you just want access to benefits or drugs or something. Yeah. And again, that can change based on the social identity that you have. So like, unfortunately, a black person might be more likely to be under suspicion for like, you're just seeking drugs or something. Which is a horrible thing to think, but these stereotypes and these sort of biases are deeply ingrained in like the medical system.
Yeah.
So my main argument is that patient self-report is crucial health data and can be supported by other sources to paint a multimodal picture of a fibromyalgia patient's health. And as I'll get to in just a second, clinical care would be improved with trust and belief in the patient. So, how do we tie all this into philosophy? This is where we move into the realm of epistemic injustice. What is it, and how can we apply it to healthcare? So epistemic injustice is a broad topic, and it can encompass concepts such as, and here I'm quoting from KID 2017, who has voice and who doesn't? Are voices interacting with equal agency and power? In whose terms are they communicating? Who is being understood and who isn't, and at what cost? Who is being believed, and who is even being acknowledged and engaged with? Epistemic injustice is an injustice done to a person in their capacity as a knower, as someone who has knowledge. It occurs when your words are seen as not credible, and this is directly linked to the stereotypes of the social group you are perceived to be a member of. I'm describing the first kind of epistemic injustice here, which is testimonial injustice. So this happens between interlocutors, speakers and hearers in a conversation or a place for testimony. That sounds maybe kind of confusing, so I'll give two very basic examples. So we've got a woman in the 50s offers some pertinent information into a conversation between her colleagues at work. She is ignored or her suggestion is rejected because the stereotypes pertaining to her gender at that time suggest she is less intelligent than her male counterparts and therefore can't contribute anything useful. Another very simple example is a black man is giving information about a crime to a police officer, but his testimony is rejected because the stereotypes pertaining to his race suggest that he would lie to the police.
Right.
In both cases, this is an injustice. Miranda Fricker, writing in 2007, says that to be given a credibility deficit, so your level of credibility is lowered, you are impugned in terms of both competence and sincerity.
So what does that mean? You're seen as less competent and sincere?
Yeah, so it could be one or both, but if you're seen as less competent, it is the woman with her male colleagues example. She is not seen as competent as even having the knowledge to contribute there. Or you're seen as insincere, so maybe you are lying, maybe you are exaggerating or something, and that's our example with the black man in front of the police officer.
Got you.
So so not offering truthful information. And I'll get to this, but I argue that fibromyalgia patients are both seen as incompetent and insincere when talking to medical professionals. Fricker says that this is an injustice that degrades people in terms of their very humanity. If you take a key factor of being treated like an intelligent being as a factor for humanity, but it also has severe practical impacts on victims' lives. So, for example, if your words and opinions are constantly ignored or discounted, you may eventually lose the confidence to speak up at all. This is called testimonial smothering. Ooh. And this can have a huge impact on your confidence and how you interact with the world. And if you are judged to be incompetent, you might be passed up for a promotion or career advancement. If you're judged to be insincere when you are telling the truth, you could be arrested, fined, prosecuted, jailed. Fricker also describes the practical effects of epistemic injustice in terms of a tracker prejudice, one that tracks you across all areas of life. So, for example, the police officer thinks you're lying, so you're arrested, so you have to spend all your money bailing yourself out, so you can't pay rent that month, so you end up homeless. It's a knock-on sort of thing. So how can we apply this to the case of fibromyalgia patients in particular? So, first of all, the doctor's appointment is a place specifically for testimony. The doctor asks you what's wrong and you tell them. If you're seen as if you're given a credibility deficit, so the things you say aren't seen as credible, that's obviously going to impact how you're treated and the care that you get. So if we talk about the stereotypes that mean that fibromyalgia patients are often given this credibility deficit, the stereotypes of them hark back to hysteria, as we've mentioned, so this sort of like female irrationality and illness. There are stereotypes of fibromyalgia patients being fakers, people who are just whinging or drama queens. There's a wonderfully terrible quote from a paper where someone summarised fibromyalgia patients being seen as crazy, lazy, illness-obsessed and weak women patients.
Oh, my God.
Which...
What the hell?
That sums it all up, really. But it's that whole thing of like, so they're seen as like crazy, so they're not like competent on expressing what's going on with them. But they're also like lazy and obsessed with being sick and all of this, so they're not being sincere. It's horrible. And also, so other reasons they might be seen as less than competent is that compared to the doctor, they don't have this like medical terminology. They might be speaking with a lot of emotion because, if you live in chronic pain, that might be an upsetting thing to recount.
It's a personal thing, yeah.
But it might cause a doctor to be like, oh, God, what's going on with this one? And also, the sincerity thing. So they might be seen as hypochondriacs or drug seeking or quote-unquote benefits cheating, although good luck getting benefits with one of these illnesses. Unfortunately,
it's not the one to choose, maybe.
No, exactly. Patients also sometimes get these very negative labels given to them. They're seen as like heart sink patients, which literally just means they come in and the doctor goes, for God's sake, sort of thing. Which is just a horrible way to describe a patient group. So there's sort of like blame on the patient. And the illness itself, as we've mentioned, it has this sort of low legitimacy because it's contested, because it's invisible. You can't look at someone and know whether or not they have it, because it's poorly understood. And unfortunately, that reflects poorly on the patient rather than science and medicine for not knowing enough about it yet. And I brought this up earlier, but because it isn't very clearly physical or mental, it means it's seen as a sort of classificatory monstrosity. And it has really low prestige among healthcare workers. There was this series of surveys done of like nurses and healthcare providers. And Album and Rasmussen, were they Swedish? Scandinavian again.
Again with the Scandinavians.
But it's held steady over time. The illnesses with high prestige were like ones that were like life-threatening and you could fix with like very complicated new cool machinery. And
that's the one that the health practitioners want to be a part of.
Yeah.
Well, it's weird that different like specialties that doctors go into have such different prestiges along with them. There's like, I've heard that, maybe I'm wrong with this, osteopathy has like, it's like a massive boys club and it's like where you want to go if you want to like earn a lot of money and like be part of like, men's clubs kind of sect, and I'm like, what?
So
it's
interesting.
It's bones.
Yeah.
Why? Why bones?
Well, the things that have really low prestige are things like mental health illnesses, particularly like depression, also eating disorders, anorexia, HIV/AIDS, really low prestige, cirrhosis of the liver. It's often seen as like self-inflicted, and it's like, well, there are usually reasons for alcoholism, and it's not just the patient. Oh, I hate that whole like, well, they did it to themselves. It's like, could you be compassionate for a hot sec?
Yeah, honestly.
And fibromyalgia is always at the bottom of these lists, and that held true over a 20-year period. And they came back and surveyed people like 4 times.
And they were still like, yeah, not fibromyalgia.
Yeah, and that's wild to me.
Crazy.
Like, people are like, oh, I don't want to deal with that, and those people. And physicians like report going, well, I tend to just sort of refer them away, or I will try and avoid them. And it's like,
I'm making a shocked face.
I know.
for the listener.
So the result of all this is that there is widespread scepticism and disbelief from healthcare providers. Patients face invalidation or dismissal. They might be talked down to, which means their mental and physical health can get worse. It means it could lead to the breakdown of this doctor-patient relationship, which will always harm the patient more. And some people are disenfranchised from the medical system altogether. They start associating healthcare spaces with like humiliation and fear. This is an injustice, and there should be huge ethical ramifications for practitioners for treating patients this way. Yeah. And that's the crux of my epistemic injustice and fibromyalgia thing there, is that it is an injustice, even though it's a sort of subtle injustice, shall we say. It is an injustice, and it does have very practical negative effects, and it is worth digging into and finding out the intricacies of that and how we can maybe reverse some of this and improve doctor-patient relationships and therefore health outcomes. With 5 minutes to go, there is also another type of epistemic injustice, which is hermeneutical injustice.
Hey, it comes back up.
Dr. Herman.
Dr. Herman.
So this occurs, and this is the jargony bit, and then I'll break it down a bit better, when a gap in the collective hermeneutical resources means a certain group is unable to make sense of their experiences when it would be advantageous for them to do so. So an example that will explain that.
Yes, please.
This comes from Fricker as well. This is, so women in the workplace before the term sexual harassment existed. So they were being treated badly by their male counterparts, but were unable to express why the treatment was wrong, because they didn't have this label.
So they didn't even know. They knew it was wrong because
they were having a bad time. It was upsetting them, but they couldn't go like, this is the thing.
They didn't band together because they were all like, well, this sucks, but I don't really know what it is. Just kind of general suckiness.
Yeah. So there's that, which is like, not having the right language. So you can talk in terms of like patients not having the medical terminology to be treated seriously, or patients not really knowing what epistemic injustice is, so they can't say why the way they're being treated by their practitioner is wrong. But also, this has to do with the way that people speak, like their dialect or their accent or the terms and the phrases that they use. So you could be given a credibility deficit based on your dialect, your accent. So, for example, we know that certain accents or dialects are unfairly taken as indicative of low intelligence. Mm-hmm. So an example would be like someone from like the Southern American states, that sort of very exaggerated, I'm not going to do it.
Southern twang.
Yes, exactly. Is sometimes seen as indicative of low intelligence, which is not fair. It's just the way someone's talking.
Yes.
And then there are 2 key things about fibromyalgia and expressiveness here. And this is given by, I want to say, Kidd and Carell, 2017. They give the examples of, well, fibromyalgia, we've got difficulties of inarticulacy and ineffability. So inarticulacy, we don't have the vocab to adequately talk about the levels of pain, fatigue and brain fog experienced. There are examples like people saying, well, it's like the worst flu you've ever had. It's like a migraine all over my body. But that's still never going to really explain the experience.
Yeah, that paints a good picture, but it is still ultimately subjective.
Yeah. And then ineffability is just, again, these are subjective experiences. Even if you could describe them evocatively enough, a person who hasn't ever lived with widespread chronic pain can probably not truly understand how distressing it is to live with. Yeah. And then the way that patients speak is often derided as complaining, moaning, whinging, and it's like, well,
you go to the doctors,
right? Surely
I'm just here to say I'm feeling fine.
Oh yeah,
that's so me at the doctors though.
But I think this has got something to do with the way that fibromyalgia is poorly handled in a treatment. In that patients keep coming back because they have to, because it's like, well, I tried this thing and it didn't work, so what's next? And that's how they eventually get this label of like heart sink patients. The doctor's like, oh God, they've come back again and like, there's nothing I can do. Yeah. I think it really impacts their sort of like sense of self in their professional role to be like, I'm supposed to be able to fix people and I can't do that. Yeah. But yeah, and I think that sort of like frustration there turns to seeing the patient as like whinging and moaning and again, this sort of like weird irrationality. Anyway, the knock-on effect of this is that patients are seen again as incompetent and insincere. So hermeneutical injustices perpetuate testimonial injustices and they reinforce each other, basically. So fibromyalgia patients report these frequent bad experiences in healthcare, and many of their complaints link back to not being believed or being told things couldn't possibly be that bad or seen as just trying to get out of work. Their illness lacks legitimacy and they're not seen as credible patients, and it's a huge issue. Quality of life is already low in fibromyalgia, so we need to revolutionise not just the treatments for fibro, but how fibro patients are treated in healthcare. And changes in this area would stand to benefit other contested illness patients like ME and long COVID. So thank you for letting me talk your ear off for a very long time about my work.
Thank you for talking my ear off for a very long time about your work.
I have a couple of main takeaways here, which is epistemic injustice leads to poor treatment of patients, which makes them physically and mentally worse off, and that should be an ethical issue. There's lots of data missing when it comes to fibromyalgia in terms of what we even know about the disease, what we're able to image and all this kind of thing, and then also in terms of the patients studied. A lot of people are just not being studied or in the literature yet. Patient self-report, I argue, is health data and should be taken as such. And I also argue that contested for illnesses is not a useful category, as it just makes people sort of vaguely suspicious of the patient groups, and technically all illnesses are contested.
Well, yeah, like I kept bringing up motor neuron disease, like, well, this also kind of falls into this category. So we're going to call this episode then, not contested illnesses. Contested in quotation marks.
And my little wrap-up was the Turing-Roche North Star, while not dealing at all with fibromyalgia specifically, nevertheless highlights important and exciting plans or ways to use data to improve clinical care for patients. And I think these areas could improve the fibromyalgia patient experience, and in some cases are already starting to be implemented in fibromyalgia research, which is exciting and, dare I say, hopeful.
And I think it's super exciting that you've laid out these 3 themes for the Turing-Roche partnership that, again, like you said, aren't to do with fibromyalgia at all. But you've brought it all together and you can see, all of this stuff, it's useful for fibromyalgia, and I think it could be useful. And hopefully people, are interested in it and feel somewhat inspired and can have a think about it and think, what epistemic injustice can you see? Maybe not within fibromyalgia, but, other things that you're dealing with. Brilliant.
Well, thank you, Florence, and thank you everyone else for listening. And get excited, because next time it's Florence's research.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Day-to-Day Health. If you've got any questions or comments, please DM us on our Instagram @DayTodayHealth or email us at daytodayhealth@gmail.com. Also, this podcast was created as part of the Turing-Roche Community Scholar Scheme, but all opinions expressed aren't those of the Alan Turing Institute or Roche. The show notes, transcripts and references to the research we talk about can be found at daytodayhealth.github.io. That does it for us, and we'll catch you next time.